Hi, Karen. How are you this afternoon?
How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Can you hear me and see me okay?
I can. Great to meet you.
Perfect. The same to you. Thanks
Thank
ever so much for taking the time this afternoon.
Of course. Of course. Yeah. Just remind me, I'm at 3 o'clock Eastern. What time is it in Colombia?
It's the same.
Okay. For some reason I thought it would be different, but I haven't checked my time zone charts
We're
before
all
hopping.
good.
Yeah, yeah. Awesome. Well, I'm so glad that we have this opportunity to meet, and thanks to Sam for connecting us. Um, I think this is such an interesting topic and one that I've never actually explored on the podcast. So I'm really interested for myself as well as for the listeners to hear more about
Super.
what you're doing and the different aspects as I was prepping for the episode, just looking at some of the different aspects of what to consider when you, and I don't want to steal the topic yet, I want you to actually share it, do what you're doing. So maybe a good place for us to start is just share a little bit about what you do, how you work with people, and maybe a little bit of the personal story that got you where you are.
Wow, yeah, that's a lot of
I know.
information.
I know. So I usually just start really broad, and then I'm sure we'll
hmm
cover most of that throughout the hour. So feel free to just take it wherever you'd like.
Great. Well, just very, very briefly, my name is Andrew. I run an international yoga community here in the city of Medellin in Colombia. We cater both to the local population, teaching classes and teacher trainings in Spanish, but we also cater a lot to the international community as well, doing both 200 and 300 hour teacher training programs, as well as internships programs and Spanish languages courses for yoga teachers as well. So I think the story of kind of how we got there is really a story of sort of how my yoga journey kind of grew organically over the years. So perhaps I'll start just by talking a little bit about that, and then we'll take things from there. From the moment that I graduated, I've been teaching languages around the world. I actually started with Latin and ancient Greek, which is a pretty unusual combination of languages, but those brought me out to the United States, where I worked for a couple of years in a liberal arts college, which was really, really fun. But it was sort of my first, adult job, as it were. And I started to go through, a lot of things that adults go through with the stresses and pressures of work, with being so far from my family, with, a relationship that was really important to me ending at the time. And so I wanted to do something that would just completely surprise myself, just something totally different. Um, and, all of the time that I was in college, I was thinking, I'm never going to take a yoga class. Those people are really, really weird. And I still think yoga people are weird. I'm just one of them myself right now, right? So yeah, that's where I went along to my first yoga class. It was in this beautiful little log cabin in the middle of the mountains, with like a fireplace in the middle, and it was just really idyllic. And that gave me my first taste of doing yoga, which was something that really stayed with me throughout the different years as I've traveled around the world. A couple of years later, I found myself in Spain, where I really developed my yoga practice. I did, all kinds of different styles of yoga, from power yoga to hot yoga to even some acro yoga as well, which was kind of literally turned me upside down. Um, and at some point, I decided, well, I'm teaching all of these languages, and now I want to add yoga to that picture as well. And so that's where I took my first teacher training program. And because I had, a pretty decent grasp of Spanish by that point, and I'd met many people from Colombia and from Venezuela, and they'd said to me, hey, if you're really looking for a place to start a new community, have you ever considered the city of Medellin? And I, of course, had never heard of Medellin in my life before. I really knew very, very little about Colombia, but I thought, well, I'm an adventurous kind of person, so I'm just gonna book a flight out there and see what's to be seen. And so in 2015, that's where I arrived out here in Medellin. And at that time, there was almost no yoga here at all. it was still something really on the fringes. Maybe some people who are more kind of international in one side of the city had maybe tried it, but most other Colombians had never really heard of yoga. They were a bit suspicious of what it might be. Um, and so I just began collaborating with different yoga projects around the city before eventually opening up Flying Tree Yoga Studio, which is where I find myself still today, running all of these different yoga initiatives. And I think it was, since the beginning, it's always been this really beautiful opportunity to bring both local people and people from all around the world together to provide this space where people can really celebrate life through their practice, which I think is such a gorgeous opportunity. And many people, when they come here from abroad, they're looking for community. They don't want just to be another tourist. They don't want to just to be another traveler. They want to really get stuck in and meet local people and make friends. And I think that the yoga studio is a really, really great way for people to do that as well.
Hmm.
So in a nutshell, that's kind of how our program got started.
Wow, that's so interesting. Do you consider yourself the kind of person who travel comes easy, going into unique situations comes easy for you? Because it sounds like you picked probably one of the most challenging things, just just in the abstract of the idea of going to a place that never has yoga. Is that part of sort of the kind of person you are, do you think?
I guess so. I mean, I've always been fascinated by travel. I remember even when I was a little boy, we went to an island called Rhodes, it's a Greek island, but it's off the coast of Turkey. And I just remember one day there, wandering outside the accommodations that we were staying in and wandering down the street with my parents and just being fascinated by how different everything looked, how different the smells were, the taste of the food. And I think, right from that really early age of, 6 or 7 years old, there was just this interest in being in other parts of the world that was, sort of born in me. And moving out to the United States and working there as one of my first jobs as well, I think radically sort of changed my perceptions of who I was and what I could do, and really kind of opened up the possibilities. And I didn't really want to go back to this kind of small, rainy island where I was born in, and I really just wanted to continue indulging my curiosity and moving around the world. And I think that if you're the kind of person who yeah, is adventurous and likes to meet people, I think you can really get stuck into many different places around the world and find really beautiful and unique communities there for sure.
Hmm. Now, I hear an accent in your voice. I don't want to assume. I read a little bit, obviously, about your bio. Tell us where you're from originally.
Yeah, so I was born near London in the United Kingdom. So I spent sort of the first half of my life in the UK, which, I still love it, even if I don't want to live there anymore. But ever since I graduated, I've really just been moving around the world and sort of being in these different places in the United States, in Spain, in parts of Asia, and now for over 10 years out here in Colombia. Now I've got a family here, I've got a baby boy, and so I'm kind of here to stay, or so I
Yeah.
hope anyway.
Yeah. And I mean, London certainly is an area that has lots of yoga studios and it's a very active. Have you ever taught in London at all, or at that point were you gone?
That's the funny thing. I have never taught yoga in my own country, if you can believe that. Most of my teaching journey has been in Southeast Asia, where I was able to do my teacher training and was actually able to take an internships program myself before I moved out to Colombia. And then it's mostly been in Latin America, principally Colombia, since that point.
Hmm. So one of the things that I think about is when you touched on before the lack of exposure and maybe even a little bit of a suspicion that people in the area that you're in had towards yoga, which I live in Boston. I mean, I've been teaching for 22 years. I remember when I first started taking yoga classes in 1999, there weren't that many studios, but once there were some studios, they were very popular. There was very little barrier to interest from Americans. I'm curious, when you went into Medellin and you were thinking this is something I want to do, how did you break through some of the maybe resistance or lack of exposure and some of the beliefs that maybe people had in their mind about yoga?
Well, I think that cultural shift has happened naturally, honestly. Um, I suppose a lot of it I've seen sort of happening during and post pandemic. I think during the pandemic, people found themselves with a lot of time on their hands, and they were able to maybe turn to these other sort of cultural practices that could help them to be with themselves, to be more comfortable in their bodies, be more comfortable in their minds. And since the pandemic has finished, it's been really incredible to see um, all kinds of health and wellness services, doctors, therapists, have been recommending yoga to their clients, their patients as a really excellent sort of complementary practice. But not just that, you see all of these companies that are now beginning to value the health and well-being, for example, of their employees. And they want to organize, yoga activities in companies. And there's just as well, I see this really enormous impetus in the younger generation, people who are sort of now in their early 20s and their mid 20s, who are just so much more concerned with spirituality in a non-religious way, and who really want to embrace these practices that have been offered from other parts of the world as a way to connect with themselves. So I'm really beginning to see a whole generation of influencers and people who others look up to and admire, and follow online, who are also just really getting into these yoga practices, which I think it's just an incredible cultural shift that's kind of happening by itself, as it were.
So that sounds like you maybe the timing of things and your obvious enthusiasm for the practice just sort of merged together and things just started to pick up once you opened your studio. Is that how it sort of
I
went?
think that's a fair assessment, and I think that it all sort of very much depends on where you are, right? I think that urban centers, places where people are exposed to lots of new ideas, lots of new, I mean, everything from new foods to new styles of exercise and whatnot. Those kinds of people are always going to be much more open to trying new things such as yoga. So, I don't suppose if you go out to some of these small mountain villages around Colombia that you're going to find the same sort of attitude. But here, I mean, Medellin is a very international city. There's a lot of, influence, especially from the United States here in this city. Not just people from the US living here, but also Colombians who now live in places like Miami, for example. So a lot of sort of cross-cultural pollination that happens here as well. And I think that all kind of forms part of this complex picture as to why it is that yoga has sort of grown. But it's certainly been a very beautiful thing to, have lived that myself, to have been at the center of all of that happening, because I do remember, the first sort of Spanish classes that we ran, it was just a couple of old ladies for about 2 years. They'd be our only practitioners, and just, yeah, little by little, we've really managed to connect on so many more levels with the local population, which has just been such a gift.
Yeah, it's funny when you said something about the mountainous areas of Colombia. I'm actually talking back and forth with a yoga teacher. We've been corresponding in Instagram. She actually just joined my monthly membership. Shout out to Jessie if she's listening. And she lives in Australia, and she is
Mm.
sort of, as she defines it, a rural community. And so she and I were chatting about sort of the type of student she's seeing because of where she is, and there really isn't a lot of familiarity with yoga. And she and I were just chatting about how that would inform the way she teaches. So I would imagine, on some level, that even though you're in an urban area, there was an educational process that was happening for you. So what were you doing to sort of bring the practice to your community? What did that look like?
Yeah. So again, being an organization with such a focus on community here, we've always tried to do a huge number of different free events. Everything from free. We run free yoga classes. 5, 6, 7 times a year. We're going to be having a weekly karma yoga class for free with sound healing on a Fridays. Um, we have been supporting some local initiatives as well. There's been bringing yoga out to some of the disadvantaged neighborhoods around the city and offering it to children in sort of recreational centers out in these places as well. So there's a lot of different ways, to be able to connect with the local community. And then, surprisingly, a lot of those people who met us maybe 3 or 4 years ago in one of these open day events or sound healings are now in our teacher training program. So again, it's just this very organic process, but really having that value of community and not just saying that we have a value of community, because I think a lot of places like to say that they have, community kind of at the center of what they do, but really working hard to promote that, doing everything from yoga brunches to dances and whatever, just to get people in and get people interested has been part of the process.
Yeah, I would imagine even if they come not for yoga and an event, for some people it's just being in the physical space and breaking through any resistance they might have to being in a yoga studio, and then maybe they'll come back the next week for the class since they were there for something social.
Absolutely. And, we have some really gorgeous and very eye-opening artwork here in the studio, which I think helps bring people back. You can check our website out if you want to see that. But we found a Venezuelan artist actually who just did this enormous mural across one of the walls, which has got all kinds of different nature and this beautiful place that sort of represents the spirit of Medellin in it as well. And I think once people come in and they feel it's this very sort of striking and beautiful, but also warm and welcoming space, they want to come back for sure. I also credit my teaching team. All of my teaching team here are locals, and they're very genuine people as well as being extremely skilled teachers and very warm people as well. And I think that obviously helps. A lot of our students feel looked after, they feel cared for. Everybody knows each other by name, which helps as well. Not easy when you've got, over 1,000 different names in your sort of concurrent student directory. But yeah, I think all of these things help for sure.
Yeah. And it reminds me, when you were just talking about the artwork, it made me think about sort of the cultural influences of, let's say, just where you are, and you're not Colombian.
I'm
And
not.
right. And so I'm wondering, how do you navigate that, right? Especially when you just said there are people on your team who are from the area. You're the owner of the studio, you're not, kind of does that come up at all? I don't know in the area if there are other businesses
Absolutely.
run by people who aren't from Colombia. So talk about anything that comes up for you on that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question because it's something that I have to navigate every day, which is how do I allow my team to exercise their own creativity and bring their own identity to their practice? And so it is something that we see a lot here, people doing cacao ceremonies, they grow cacao just down the road, as it were, from here. People offering all kinds of elements of, their sort of ancestral spiritual practices here. I mean, there's a huge spiritual tradition in Colombia as well. That's a lot of people know it as being connected to ayahuasca, and as they call it, yahe out here. Although that's only a sort of a small part of it, but you do definitely see people wanting to bring in all of these elements of traditional Colombian spirituality into the space. And I think for me, as an owner, somebody who has come from something very, very different, it's really important for me to be able to provide the space and kind of freedom to each of my teachers and kind of trust them, as it were, to do what they're best at. And I think that when you have a team that you trust and people that you trust, you're able to give people a certain amount of free rein to really do things the way that they see best. And that really kind of brings out their own talents and their own abilities as well.
Yeah, it's interesting when you mentioned the ayahuasca. I just watched 60 Minutes, I think it was last weekend, and I don't remember where they went. I want to say Hawaii, but I don't think it was Hawaii. It wasn't Colombia, but it was all about for US veterans that have
Hmm.
PTSD and doing
Sure.
ayahuasca as a
Hmm.
part of their treatment plan. And in the, no, it was Mexico. And in the retreat
Hmm.
center where they were doing it, there was a lot of, I think, probably Toltec type medicine men and women that were part of the
Hmm.
ceremonies. And there was a lot of things that I didn't necessarily understand, but I could recognize from the story were
Sure.
ancient healing practices, separate from and part of the actual administration of the ayahuasca. So when you mention that in regards to Colombia, I'm curious, especially for the listener, especially for the US listener who could have a particular perception of Colombia. Tell us
Mhm.
a little bit about Medellin. What is it like to live there? I mean, you're from the UK, which is about Guinness beer and shepherd's pie and, going to the pub and going to the theater and all.
Uh-huh.
I imagine it's very different, and I'm not exactly sure how. Tell us what you love about it and what it's like to live there.
Yeah. So I think the first thing to mention is that Medellin is a very international city. It's very beautiful. We're about 3,000 feet here in the middle of the Andes Mountains. And it's an extremely green city as well. It's known as the City of Eternal Spring. So we get this beautiful sort of year-round climate that's between sort of 20 and 30 degrees centigrade. And plenty of rains to freshen up the city as well. So it's really a gorgeous place to live. It's very visually striking. You can take these cable cars that kind of go up the hillsides and out into the national parks that are sort of around the city as well. So I think a lot of people are really struck by the natural beauty that Medellin has as well. So it's a mountain culture. People have lived in this area for a few hundred years. Um, Obviously, there's a very complex history of colonization and, how indigenous groups have also survived that to, retain their sort of cultural practices and cultural identity. And so around Colombia, you get a lot of different indigenous groups living in protected territories now as well. And so that's where, still a lot of the ancestral medicine is practiced today. Um, and it's a very diverse country. I mean, you've got everything from the Amazon jungle to these enormous grasslands out towards Venezuela to coastal desert to extremely high snow-capped mountains to very dense sort of Pacific jungle forests and everything in between. So it's extremely varied. And I think along with that geographical variety, you get an enormous amount of cultural variety, enormous number of foods that you go to every part of Colombia, eat something different, and that's what makes travel and tourism very exciting around here as well, I think. So it's a country that you could really explore for many, many years and, never kind of finish it all. Um, and so here in Medellin, I think it's perhaps one of the most modern cities in Colombia, along with Bogota, which is the capital. People think that, when you go to Colombia, you're sort of going to find lots of shacks and mud huts. But I mean, here we've got, a lot of beautiful architecture as well. A lot of very modern facilities. There's, a really great metro system here. There's a tram system. There's a great bus system. And so, yeah, I think many people are often surprised by just kind of how modern sort of what they find when they come to Medellin is as well, which is what makes it so attractive for tourists and sort of digital nomads and people who want to stay here for a little bit longer and just, live for a little while. So, yeah, a lot going on in Medellin. Highly, highly recommend it as a great place to visit.
Yeah, sounds lovely. I've never been to Costa Rica, but I've also heard of Costa Rica described similarly, very lush, very healthy foods,
Hmm.
organic farming, and
Hmm.
a lot of people who are from other countries
Sure.
going to stay there. So one of the things that struck me, and you sort of mentioned this casually because it's obviously second nature to you, is that you actually started a business. I mean, this is no
Mm.
small feat. I've been an entrepreneur for many years. I've never owned a yoga studio by choice. That was not really the way that I wanted to go out into the world. Although I know that starting a yoga studio and maintaining it is a lot of work and takes a certain kind of person. And especially I mean, I think primarily in the United States, we've seen I don't want to say less and less. I think though there's the emergence of sort of the corporate conglomerate of yoga studios. So you have like your core power, and different big like venture backed companies that have a whole infrastructure. When you're going to open a studio, their implementation team comes in and sets up the studio for you and puts the signage out front, right? And there's very little autonomy there, for the studio owner. So you didn't do that. You are an independent studio owner. And so I'd love to hear a little bit about how did you do that? I mean, it wasn't like you were coming from a background where you had started a business or a yoga business, which is its own entity and has unique things to consider. So how did that happen? And it obviously is still running, so you're doing it right.
Yeah, I think in the beginning it was definitely a sort of a sense of self-confidence because I'd never done something like this before. I thought, sure, I could do it. I'm sure that would be easy, right? And so, goodness, I remember all the way back to the beginning, I learned a lot on the way. For example, I tried to lay the floor to the yoga studio, the wooden floor myself the first time I did it, and that was just an absolute disaster. Oh my goodness, first of all, I cut it just right, but wooden floors expand, right? And so, a couple of weeks later, these like little waves and bumps started appearing with the, but oh my goodness. So I took the whole floor back up again and I recut it. But this time I cut it too small. And so the pieces began sliding against one another. So you'd have these little gaps between, oh my goodness. So I think one of the most important lessons that I learned at the beginning is hire a professional floor contractor to come and put in your floor for you. Um, but I think a lot of the challenge of setting up a business in a foreign country is knowing kind of what you're getting into and knowing local law and sort of all of the things that you need to do to be able to run a business legally, like all of the declarations that you've got to do, the registrations that you've got to have, and so on and so forth. So I spent a few years really just through trial and error working with people where it really didn't work out, some accountants who made just a terrible job of things. Before eventually I found, just people that I knew that I could trust, people that did a great job and who I've been working with ever since. Speaking the local language is an absolute must. I think trying to do all of this through an interpreter would have just been completely overwhelming. So being able to communicate with people fluently was certainly a huge part of that, I think. And then a lot of it has just been a huge amount of trial and error and figuring out how to do things along the way and kind of learning lessons the hard way often, I feel. But I think as long as, you've got, with Yoga Studio, I think you have to have a very varied offering to keep you going. And I think that just having the variety of different programs and courses, and we also used to offer things like massage and Thai massage and whatnot as well. Really helped us get through sort of all of these moments when we were learning, kind of the difficult lessons, and helped us to kind of grow and expand to the point where we were able to find a bit more stability. COVID obviously was a very difficult time, I think, for all yoga studios around the world. So at that point, being a small business had, its advantages. We were able to pivot very quickly to operating online, to offering, sort of courses and training programs via Zoom. But yeah, I think we're kind of now at the point where things are, more firmly established and more rooted. Having these international programs such as the internships program and the Spanish language program as well have just been a huge support for us over the years.
Hmm. Let's talk a little bit about teaching in a different language.
Sure.
I'm not sure. I mean, I can't, I obviously, I speak a little French. I don't speak any Spanish. Even when I was in Paris recently, I didn't really see any yoga studios, but I was thinking like, God, not only is Paris wonderful, but if I lived here and I taught yoga, how would that even look? Especially as someone whose native language is not that language. I think it's different if I don't know, but I would imagine if you're native language in your case is Spanish, your teachers, it comes natural to them.
Sure.
What goes on in your brain when you're, you obviously taught language prior to being a yoga teacher and you're multilingual. Just talk a little bit about that. What kind of permutations or calculations are you doing in your mind when you're teaching?
Sure. So I think, when we're teaching other teachers in our Spanish language course how to teach in Spanish, I think one of the most important things that I want people to take away from the course is to think with the language that they have, as opposed to trying to think in English or whatever, their native language is and try and translate across. Quite often I think we, as yoga teachers, we're so confident, right, when we're cueing. We've got all of these really long, kind of complicated strings of commands that just come so naturally to us. And, we've been teaching, maybe some of us for years, and we're so used to saying things X, Y, and Z. And we want to be able to communicate that way in a foreign language. But it's not realistic for us to do that unless we're a fluent speaker, which most people are not, right? So the best thing is, instead of trying to kind of force yourself to do what you would be used to doing in your own native language, is to get comfortable with working with the language that you have, right? So in the Spanish course, what we do is we introduce people to all of these key words for parts of the body, verbs of movement, how to sort of navigate space, sort of directions and prepositions. And then once they have that, to really strip their cueing down, so that they really kind of get to the absolute heart of what it is that you're trying to get the person to do, and make it simple, right? And people will pick a lot of the rest up from context. If you're using, if you're modeling the postures, people are able to look, they're able to watch. So I think that's got a huge part to do with it. And then I think the other part is be comfortable with not being perfect, right? So many of us, when we speak in a foreign language, we feel ashamed. We feel that what I'm saying is not, it doesn't sound perfect, there are grammatical mistakes, and so I better just keep my mouth shut, right? Because nobody wants to hear that. And that's a shame, because, I've also met, I always have in my mind some couple of Italian guys, that I've met in my life. Not great English, but you know what? It didn't matter. I mean, they're just there, they're gesticulating, they're making so many different mistakes, but it doesn't matter because their personality really comes through. And as a native speaker, you don't really care that, they're not speaking with perfect English, because, you can see this kind of desire to communicate, this big smile on their face. And I think that if we can kind of take that same attitude to being comfortable with not being perfect, of really just trying to connect with other human beings in a human way, I think that a lot of the rest, perfection will come with time, right? And in the meantime, just enjoy it, enjoy and be proud of what you can do, as opposed to kind of punishing yourself for what you can't do. Because again, if you're this kind of very uptight person, and the second that you make a mistake, you freeze and you clam up and you're like, oh my God, people are going to feel that as well. They're going to respond to that kind of energy. So I think that yeah, if you just learn to relax and have fun, and use the language that you do have, and just leave the rest to one side, you're going to have a much, much better time, and you'll enjoy it. And I think through enjoying the language that we use, we end up using it a lot more, as opposed to finding it this kind of painful chore, which we kind of feel that we ought to do. Then we're just not going to do it. We're not going to come back to it enough to see those kind of big improvements. But obviously,
Yeah.
doing something like taking a language course is a great option, and it's really going to help you take a step forward.
Yeah, this is a fascinating topic in and of itself when you think about the two tools that we really have are the voice, the cues that we're sharing, and the sequence within which the sequence we're offering them. And now that we're talking about this topic, it has me thinking about this whole component of the voice and the words, specifically in the cues, becomes a whole topic in and of itself. And if you even think about it from a cognitive learning standpoint, especially when the primary language might be English and you're teaching in Spanish, it sounds like what you're saying is, rather than trying, like if I want to say to somebody in downward facing dog, step your right foot forward, drop your back heel, reach your arms up, take 3 breaths. Like that's in my head what I would say to get somebody from down dog to warrior 1. So if I could say that in Spanish, I would be thinking, how do I say step your right foot forward in Spanish? And you're saying, instead of that mental task, you're teaching people certain phrases that are more indigenous to Spanish that communicate the same thing.
Sure. I mean, that's one aspect of it for sure. I mean, I think we obviously do teach all of the fundamentals, those parts of the body which, are just very helpful to know, certain verbs of motion that are very helpful to know. But of course, there's always going to be a difference between 2 languages. And, the word reach, for example, is a really great, example of where people get stuck. Because when we talk about reaching in yoga in English, reach the arms up, for example, and people think, okay, well, I'll look on my Google Translate and I'll find the verb reach and it's alcanzar in Spanish. But you can't use that word in the same way in Spanish as you can in English, because alcanzar means to actually reach and grab something, right? So you can't say reach your hands overhead, because people will be saying, well, what am I reaching for over there? What am I supposed to be, trying to grab a hold of? And so that's an example of where, for sure, it's important to kind of know those distinctions between the 2 languages. But I mean, that's something that we do when we teach the Spanish language course for yoga teachers here. We do try to look at some of those common traps that people fall into with, false friends between the 2 languages, or words that do work or that don't work. But above all, I think it's really just about learning to simplify, learning to let go of this need to be ultra technical and to try and get every last little detail down there. Technicality can come with time, right? You can learn to be technical in another language, but before you do that, before you run, you have to learn how to walk. And so beginning to, get those basic phrases down, like how do we say to step a foot between the hands? Okay, well, let's take a verb, let's take an object, the foot, let's take a direction, and done. That's a cue. That's enough, right? And then lift the torso. That's another cue. Finished. Stretch your arms. That's another cue. Finished. And I think for most people, it's so much more accessible to be able to teach in that kind of way. And then as they really integrate those more basic cues into their minds, then they can begin to add that technical detail on top.
Yeah, I mean, I think in my work with yoga teachers in my program, I use a lot of the same suggestions as yourself, which is another kind of interesting thing. Like the idea of simplifying is such an important concept that I teach, because teachers often come to me with so much they're trying to shove into the 3 to 5 seconds that they have to, let's say, get somebody from down dog to warrior 1. And so it's interesting to me that a lot of what you're teaching is similar to what I'm teaching, even though part of the reason for your approach is connected to the language component of it for someone whose native language is not Spanish. So that's kind of interesting.
Well, it's true, and just to jump in there, I mean, in our 200 and 300 hour courses, I also teach, the importance of simplicity, because we live in such an information heavy age, right? We're being constantly bombarded with so much stuff, by WhatsApps and emails and text messages and news items and God knows what else, that a lot of people, when they come into a yoga studio, what they need to do is to switch off. They don't need to be bombarded with a whole bunch of technicality. And then there's also the question of, how much technicality are people actually going to understand as well? If you talk about, fitting the head of your femur into its socket, I mean, to a lot of people, they're like, okay, that sounds lovely, but how on earth do I do that? Do you know what I mean? So I think that as yoga teachers, we need to learn what's important to say, but also learn how to say it in a way that is accessible and understandable to our students, so that, even though we're learning things like advanced anatomical concepts, we can't expect people to know what the ischial tuberosity of the pelvis is. We need to be able to say that in such a way that people are going to understand and be able to relate to.
Yeah, and that brings up another question I was thinking when you were talking, because I teach anatomy to teachers, and I'm obviously doing it in English. I'm curious, like let's say ischial tuberosities, i.e. sitting bones. If I were teaching about the anatomy of the pelvis in Spanish, would I be saying ischial tuberosities, or is there a translation for, or quadriceps, or concentric contraction, or rib cage, or, are there translations for that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, interesting because I also teach teacher trainings in Spanish and I handle the anatomy component. And so I had the very challenging task of, finding out all of this information as I had to go and sort of translate my 100-page presentation or whatever it was across into another language. And one of the things that I found was because so much of the language that we use for anatomy comes from Latin, that actually it's quite similar when we're talking about things like sort of muscles and bones and attachments and whatever. A lot of that is actually quite similar between the two languages, or you can see some kind of similarity between the two words. Yeah, I mean, for other things, for sure, you've got to learn, if you're talking about the rotator cuff, you've just got to learn what that phrase is in Spanish, and that's just a question of spending the time. But the nice thing is that when I have sort of more fluent Spanish speakers joining us for the Spanish course out here, I can share that presentation with them and say, if you want to really get stuck into anatomy in a foreign language, take a couple of hours looking through this. So yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. So it sounds like in your studio, between the Spanish language course, the 200-hour, the 300-hour, the classes, the live events, the
internships program.
Yeah. What is the internships program?
Well, I think one of the experiences that I had when I first graduated from my original 200 hours out in Thailand is that I was very lucky to be offered an internships out in Bali, in this lovely place called the Bali Silent Retreat. And it was a month of teaching classes, and it just really gave me this opportunity to, first of all, figure out what all of this information that I've been given in my 200-hour meant to me. Because quite often, especially if in these intensive month-long courses, we're sort of fed all of this information, handed a certificate, patted on the back, and then sort of pushed out the front door, as it were. And it takes time to absorb that. And I also wanted to take that time to answer the question, do I want to be a yoga teacher? Is this something that's worth pursuing in my life? And if so, who do I want to be? What is my message? What is my identity? And so that month really gave me the opportunity to sort of reflect on a lot of these questions and also just teach a whole bunch as well, right? Begin to figure out, what do I do with sequencing? How do I make a sequence that people are going to enjoy? And so when we opened up Flying Tree, we really wanted to give people that same opportunity, that opportunity to come into a space where they could be supported by experienced yoga teachers, people who've been teaching for a decade or more, who can guide them, if they need help with sequencing, to create a sequence, to come to their classes, to take their classes as a student, and then to give them kind and constructive feedback. So first of all, highlighting all of those things that are going really well, right? I think people have a tendency to want to beat themselves up after teaching their classes. So many of my interns, so many of the students that I've worked with have sat down after the class and I've said, okay, so name me a couple of things that went really well in class. And they immediately start talking about what went wrong. And, you have to stop people and say, no. Tell me what went right first, because you did a great job here and you did a great job there. And you need to recognize that. Because if you don't have fun teaching, you're not going to be doing it for very long, right? So really helping people to recognize how they're good. And then, of course, during the conversations that we have, naturally things will come up as well where, the refinements that we could make, things that didn't go so well, suggestions that we can make for next time. And so by giving people the opportunity to teach meditations and breathing sessions and yoga classes and little workshops and whatnot over the course of the month, we can really help people, find that sense of self-confidence, find that identity, of who it is that they are, and really give them that sense of drive and self-confidence so that when they finish the other side of the internship program, they can come out into the world and say, okay, now I'm ready. Now I'm ready to take the next steps of my journey. I know who I am. I've taught some classes that have been well received. I know these sequences have worked. And to have just that kind of sense of direction and purpose.
So I'm just watching the clock, and as we sort of wrap this up, I was just
Please.
when we first started our conversation, and you were describing your kind of inquisitiveness towards yoga as a practice, just that wondering, is this something for me? And so now, we kind of go through, and I've learned so much about your amazing journey over the past many years. And you really just have completely embraced it in a very unique way, in large part because you're in a place that's very different from where you were born and grew up. And so I'm curious, like, number one, when you look back at that person you were before, what do you think drove you through all of these ups and downs and bumps in the road and things you needed to do? What was really the driving force?
Yeah, I think I find it very curious sometimes when people say, oh, if you have a passion or a hobby, don't make it into your job because, you'll end up treating your hobby as a work and you won't enjoy it anymore. And I feel very differently about that. I absolutely love what I do. I love the message of yoga. I love what it's brought to my life. It's endlessly fascinating. There's so much to explore in the world of yoga, be it the philosophy or the anatomy or wherever it is that you want to spend your time sort of going down these rabbit holes. And I think that if it weren't for my passion, my curiosity, and my belief in the power of what I'm teaching, the yoga itself, I probably wouldn't have made it this far, right? So I think for me, it's always been about the yoga, and for sure, administration and dealing with legal issues and dealing with, accounts and all that kind of stuff. It's stressful. There's no kind of two ways around it. And I think any business owner would agree that, running your own business is not for everyone and it's not for the faint-hearted. But I think that if you really enjoy what it is that you're doing, then that is something that will carry you through those good times and those bad times and will kind of give you the energy. When I wake up on a Monday morning, I feel motivated to get out there and continue talking about yoga and sharing yoga and teaching yoga, no matter sort of whether I've got other sort of administrative tasks pending or whatever else is going on. So I think
Yeah.
that would be my answer.
Yeah, lovely. And the other aspect of that I think about, and you've mentioned this a couple of times in our conversation, is this idea of sort of finding your own way, finding your authentic voice. And so I'm curious how that feels to you, being someone who's taken on this teaching in a different place, right? I mean, I think about, if my authentic way is as an American, I mean, this gets to my identity. Like, do I look at myself as an American person who speaks English? And if I were to
Sure.
move to Paris, which I would love to do, and be an American person living in Paris teaching yoga, how, I don't know, I've never thought about until I, met you. How would that change at all my identity of how I viewed myself being a yoga teacher in a different place? Would that be another variable kind of in there? So I don't know what
Sure.
comes up for you about that.
I mean, our identities are always shifting, right? I mean, that is one of the key teachings of yoga is that identity is an impermanent thing and that we often get very attached to what our identity looks like, whereas there's nothing kind of really there if you kind of probe down through all of the layers. It's something that is constantly shifting. So for sure, if you found yourself in Paris being an American yoga teacher sharing, that would be another side to your identity, and that would be a way in which you sort of would change. But I think, part of what yoga tries to teach us, is this concept of anicca, the idea of constant change, is that, we need to embrace that aspect of human life, right? Which is to be constantly sort of being okay with these sort of shifting sands of identity. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that's
No,
yeah.
it's such an interesting conversation to have, this idea of identity in general, and then sort of layering it into finding our authentic way of teaching in an authentic voice, and adding in this other layer of unique experience because we have a love of a different place, and we're using that language as a way to make it accessible to people. It's kind of a fascinating topic that until we met, I never actually thought of that angle.
Mm.
So the last thing I'd love to hear about is, here we are at the beginning of 2025. What do you have on tap for this year for the studio? What's your thought as you look ahead for the rest of the year?
Yeah, well, we've been very busy here creating a 300-hour teacher training program, which has just been such a fascinating process. They say if you really want to learn something, teach it, right? So it's kind of really forced us to go deep into all of these different areas that we teach, and do a lot of research, do a lot of reading, a lot of investigation, and prepare these new experiences and explorations for our students. So we're going to be launching a 300-hour teacher training and advanced course in June in English, and then we'll have the Spanish version. So we'll translate all of that material across into Spanish and be offering a Spanish version, I imagine, early next year. So that's my that's my year's work kind of cut out for me there. But it's really been such a fascinating and fun process to craft, such a big and complex course from scratch. So yeah, we're almost there now, though.
Yeah. Now, when you're crafting it, are you sort of using the Yoga Alliance? Like, are you using their outline? Are you kind of going into that and what you want to focus on? Like, what's the part of what you want to convey in this training?
Well, the Yoga Alliance sort of rubric is, I think, very intentionally open. I mean, they really don't make a lot of demands of a 300-hour course in terms of what it must contain. It's not micromanaged in any way. Um, and so that means that you really, when you're crafting a course like that, you need to give it an intention, a philosophy, an identity, and a direction, right? It needs to be going somewhere. So for us, I think it was all about finding, how do we want to frame this exploration? How do we want to bring a sense of structure to all of these very diverse kind of elements? And for us, we named our course A Journey to the Heart, because it's all about inquiring who we are, getting to know our own nature as Satchitananda, so a being, consciousness, and bliss, and to do that through the layers of the koshas, so the physical body, the energy body, the mental body, the wisdom body, the joy body. And I think once we had that vision, it then became a question of then sort of fitting all of these very diverse components into that picture. So how can we help people explore all of these different elements of their human nature and what lies beyond that? So yeah, that's how we went about it.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. And certainly I can tell you're very passionate about the topic. So I'm sure it's going to be fantastic. Do you anticipate people that took a different kind of 200-hour might come, plus maybe some of your 200-hour graduates might attend? Is that sort of the...
That's the idea. So, although we do have our own distinct methodology here in Flying Tree, you don't need to have done a 200-hour to be able to participate in a 300-hour. We basically just make sure that we get you up to speed with, sort of our approach and our philosophy and whatnot. And then it's just really a case of taking the time to, as I say, kind of really delve in a lot deeper. 200-hour course is so brief. It's over in a flash. And I think that the beauty of a 300-hour course is it just gives you that time and that space to go so much deeper into a lot of these areas. So I'm really excited to get going, and everyone is welcome.
Yeah, that's amazing. So as we wrap up here, share with us how to find you on social media. I'm going to include the link, obviously, in the show notes, and anything else you might want to share about this training or any other way that people can take your trainings.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is let's start chatting. You know, I always super happy to take half an hour to have a Zoom call to answer questions on WhatsApp. Eh, have a little delve around our websites as well if you're interested in taking internships, if you'd like to take a language course, or if you want to train with us in some kind of way. We'd love to have people, yeah, continue to help our this beautiful little community that we've got out here in Latin America continue to flourish. So
Yeah,
please, yeah,
that sounds
come and
great.
join.
I know a lot of my listeners might, well, definitely don't live in Medellin. So is there an online
Sure.
that they could participate in?
Sure. So right now we're offering the Spanish language course online. So we've had people from all over the US and indeed all over the world join that through Zoom as well. And that's a course that just works really, really well online as well. You know, it can be difficult sometimes with asana and whatnot to really communicate that effectively across the camera. But I think with when we're doing sort of like work on language, that's something that really does go over the camera very well.
That's great. That's great. So again, for people, for you listening, all the links to your website program that has the programs, your social media, you're on Instagram. Remind me the
Mhm.
handle.
Yeah, so we have two profiles. We have a Spanish profile for at Flying Tree Yoga, and then we have an English profile, which is at Yoga Internships. So yeah, please have a good look through both of them because there's some great content there as well.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, it was wonderful to meet you. I really appreciate the time. This was such a fascinating story and definitely a unique and inspiring one. And I'm sure there are going to be people listening that are thinking now, wow, that could be me. I could do that. So thank you so much for sharing your
My
enthusiasm and
pleasure.
you. All
And
right.
thank you for, yeah, such a great and free-flowing conversation. It's been just lovely um, to hear such interesting questions. So my pleasure,
Yeah.
and thank you ever so much.
I'm glad you liked it. This will go live on Monday, so I'll send you the link then. And yeah,
Sounds lovely.
we'll get it out there right quick.
Thank you ever so much, Karen. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, bye-bye.
Goodbye now.